In episode 53, titled Understand Retention, Storage, and Replication Rules for Compliance, retention is framed as a balancing act across risk, cost, and genuine need. Organizations keep data because it supports customers, operations, analytics, and legal defensibility, but every extra day of storage can widen exposure if that data is sensitive. At the same time, deleting too aggressively can break business processes, undermine investigations, or violate contractual obligations. The point is to treat retention as a deliberate decision system where the reasons to keep data are explicit and the reasons to delete are equally explicit. Retention means how long data stays stored, which sounds straightforward until teams realize that stored includes more than a primary database table. Retention also includes archived exports, replicated copies, backups, and sometimes cached reporting layers that quietly extend the life of the same information. Retention decisions should be described in time terms that a stakeholder can understand, such as days, months, or years, but they also need boundaries like what triggers the clock and what qualifies as the official record. When retention is clear, reporting and compliance conversations stop being debates over which dataset is the real one and become discussions about agreed timelines. Storage is where data lives and who can access it, and that definition includes both physical location and logical control. A dataset stored in a managed service, a file repository, or an analytics warehouse may be equally stored, but the access pathways and risk profiles can be very different. Access is not only about usernames. It includes role design, permissions, auditability, and whether sensitive fields such as personally identifiable information, PII, are exposed broadly or limited to a narrow set of approved roles. Storage choices also affect what evidence can be produced during audits, because logs, access histories, and change records often differ by platform. When storage is defined well, teams know where the official copy lives and how to prove who touched it and when. Replication means creating copies for resilience and availability, which is a practical necessity for reliable systems and a frequent source of compliance surprises. Replication can be synchronous or asynchronous, can occur within a region or across regions, and can happen intentionally or as a side effect of managed services. Each replicated copy increases reliability, but it also increases the number of places where data exists, which complicates retention and deletion. Replication also changes incident impact math, because a compromise that reaches one environment may reach replicas if controls and segmentation are not consistent. A compliance-minded view treats every replica as real data that must be governed, not as a technical detail to be ignored. Retention periods should align to policy, contracts, and business value, because those are the constraints that define what appropriate looks like. Policy often reflects risk appetite and internal standards. Contracts can impose specific obligations on how long records must be kept or when they must be destroyed, and business value explains why a dataset still matters after the immediate transaction is complete. Even when regulations are not named explicitly, organizations typically operate under external expectations that demand consistency, evidence, and predictable handling of records. When retention is aligned to those drivers, the organization can explain its choices calmly, which matters when customers, auditors, or leadership ask why a dataset is still present or why it was deleted. Over-retaining sensitive data is a common compliance failure because it increases breach impact without delivering proportional value. Sensitive records often include PII, financial identifiers, authentication artifacts, or detailed behavioral logs, and the harm from exposure grows with volume and age. Older records are frequently less useful, less accurate, and harder to justify, yet they remain attractive to attackers because they can be aggregated, sold, or used for fraud. Over-retention also increases internal misuse risk, since access paths multiply over time and exceptions accumulate. A strong program treats data minimization as a risk control, not as a cost-cutting trick. Backups require special care because they count as stored copies, even when they are treated as emergency only. Backups are often designed to be durable, long-lived, and difficult to modify, which is exactly what creates tension when deletion requirements apply. A dataset may be deleted from the primary system, but if it remains in backups for months, the organization may still be retaining it in a meaningful way. Backup retention needs its own explicit timeline, its own access controls, and its own evidence trail, because "it is in backup" is not a compliance excuse. It is a retention fact. Mature programs also clarify whether restores reintroduce old data and how that risk is managed when recovering from outages. A customer record scenario makes these trade-offs concrete because customer data is both operationally important and reputationally sensitive. Consider account profiles, support tickets, transaction history, and identity verification artifacts, where some elements are needed to serve the customer and others are only needed for limited windows. The organization might need recent records for dispute resolution and support quality, while older records may be required only in aggregated form for trend analysis. In that environment, retention decisions become easier when the dataset is segmented by purpose, so high-risk fields can expire sooner while lower-risk summaries remain. The key is that retention is tied to why the record exists, not simply to the fact that the system is capable of keeping it forever. Replication complicates this scenario further because replicas can exist across regions and environments, sometimes with different lifecycle settings. A production dataset may replicate to a disaster recovery region, to a read-only analytics environment, and to a testing environment that was seeded months ago and never cleaned up. Tracking where replicas exist is essential because deletion or retention changes must reach every location to be meaningful. Without that tracking, teams can meet policy in one place while unintentionally violating it elsewhere, which creates the worst kind of compliance problem, a hidden one. A practical approach treats replica inventory as part of the dataset's documentation, not as an optional engineering note. Replicated data should be secured with the same controls as the primary, because a weaker replica becomes the easiest entry point. Controls include encryption, access limitations, audit logging, and segmentation so that a compromise in a lower trust environment does not automatically expose production-grade records. Replication paths should also be understood as data flows that can be monitored, because unusual replication behavior can signal configuration mistakes or malicious activity. When replicas are protected equally, resilience improves without quietly expanding the attack surface. When replicas are protected unevenly, replication becomes a risk amplifier rather than a reliability feature. Deletion processes should be documented and verified, because deletion that only exists on paper is not a real control. Deletion includes how records are selected, what conditions trigger deletion, how long deletion takes to complete, and how the organization confirms that the action actually occurred across primary storage, replicas, and backups. Verification matters because silent failures are common, such as a job that stops running, a permission change that blocks deletes, or a schema change that breaks selection logic while leaving no obvious alarm. Documentation also clarifies what deleted means in practice, such as whether data is fully removed or rendered inaccessible through irreversible transformation. When deletion is verifiable, retention promises become credible. Compliance validation relies on evidence such as logs, reports, and periodic reviews, because compliance is proven by what can be shown, not by what is intended. Logs can demonstrate access patterns and deletion events. Reports can show retention windows and replica inventories, and periodic reviews can confirm that controls still match policy as systems evolve. Reviews should look for drift, such as new environments that were created without lifecycle rules or replication settings that changed during a reliability effort. Evidence should also capture timing, because a control that runs monthly may not satisfy a requirement that expects tighter windows for highly sensitive data. When validation is routine, compliance stops being a scramble and becomes a steady operating posture. A retention and replication checklist works best when it can be repeated consistently across datasets without becoming heavy. The checklist anchors on how long the data is kept, where it lives, who can access it, and where copies exist, including backups and replicas. It also includes whether deletion is defined and verifiable, whether replica protections match the primary, and whether evidence exists to prove the system behaves as designed. The purpose is not to create bureaucracy, but to ensure the same basic questions are answered every time a new dataset is introduced or a system architecture changes. When the checklist becomes habitual, surprises shrink and accountability increases. To conclude, one useful action is to pick a single dataset and review its retention rule today as if it were being challenged by an auditor or a cautious customer. The review should confirm the official retention period, identify every place the data exists, including replicas and backups, and verify that deletion is both documented and observable through logs or reports. It should also confirm that sensitive fields are not being kept longer than necessary and that replicas carry the same protections as the primary. That one review builds the muscle memory that makes broader compliance work sustainable because it turns abstract governance into a concrete, repeatable practice. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.